Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Graham.
Aye, for proxy.
Mr. Cornick.
Aye.
Mr. Lee.
No.
Mr. Cruz.
Aye.
Mr. Sass.
Aye, by proxy.
Mr. Hawley.
Aye.
Mr. Cotton.
Aye, by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye, by proxy.
Mr. Tillis.
No, by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn.
Aye, by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
No.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 8 yeas, 14 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I want to call up my third amendment. It is ALB 21923. And this may be the easiest of the three amendments I'm bringing up for members on both sides of the aisle to vote for.
We'll be the judge of that.
You will indeed. It was a Friday morning, May 18th, 2018. I was at home in Houston. Early in the morning, I got a call on my cell phone. I had been preparing to get on a plane and fly to an event, but I was told that just minutes earlier, there had been a shooting at the Santa Fe High School outside of Houston. Santa Fe High School is about 45 minutes away from my house. Instead of going to the events that I had planned that day, I got in a truck and I headed down to Santa Fe. I was at the high school a little over an hour after the shooting had occurred. A deranged killer had walked into that high school and had systematically executed students one after the other after the other. It was utterly horrific. I spent the rest of the day with students who were injured in the hospital, with students who had survived, with parents who didn't know if their loved ones, if their children were alive. One of the challenges with a mass shooting is it takes time to identify the victims. The agony of those parents as they sat there in a gymnasium wondering, is my son, is my daughter, which side of the ledger did they fall on? Law enforcement took several hours to identify the victims. I can tell you I was pressing law enforcement to give the parents a damn answer quickly, that the agony of not knowing was horrific. That mass murderer was a juvenile. He was a student who had committed that horrific crime of violence. He was apprehended. He was incarcerated. And as they were preparing to prosecute him, the state was preparing to bring capital murder charges. And the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Texas wanted to bring federal charges. Maine Justice was raising objections to bringing federal charges, a fact that I found deeply concerning because under the applicable state laws, this mass murderer would have been eligible under state law because capital punishment is off the table for juvenile offenders pursuant to the Supreme Court, would have been eligible for early release. I picked up the phone and called Attorney General Bill Barr. And I asked Bill to examine Maine Justice's objections to bringing federal charges. I believed on the merits. This deranged psychopath had committed clear federal charges, and under the federal guidelines, he could be convicted of long sentences that would ensure that he spends the rest of his life in jail. And I believe this monster should never breathe a breath of air in the free world again. There are crimes that are too horrific that they should not be released. I told Attorney General Barr, if DOJ did not change their position, that I intended to go to the floor of the Senate and make the case publicly, that I was hearing from the parents of the kids, why are the feds not bringing this case? Thankfully, Maine Justice reversed its position, said they would bring federal charges. At the end of the day, the Department of Justice ended up bringing 11 federal charges. Now, the murderer is still awaiting trial because he's confined to a mental institution, and he may not face trial. He may be confined to a mental institution for the rest of his life. But the bill before this committee would provide an avenue for a juvenile who has committed a horrific crime, who has committed a mass murder like what happened at Santa Fe High School, to be released early. I don't believe people who have committed the very worst crimes should be released early, and at least for me, I don't wish to be party to releasing any such violent criminals early. And so this amendment is narrow. It makes clear that individuals who are convicted and sentenced to prison for murder or for forcible rape are exempted from early release. And I urge members of this committee to vote yes on the amendment. And again, I ask for a roll call vote.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. I know all of us take our responsibilities before this committee home with us when we return to our states. I do too. And over the last several weeks, I've made a point of visiting with random members of the Chicago Police Department, public defenders, prosecutors, analysts to try to get a handle on crime in my state, particularly in the city of Chicago. I've met some amazing people who have given me insights which I could never gather just working in Washington. Last week was one. I went to a group that was doing advocacy work in the toughest neighborhoods of Chicago to try to reduce gun crime. They've had some success. They have a long way to go. But these amazing individuals have dedicated their lives to try to end gun violence on the streets of Chicago, and many times risk their lives to do it. One of them is very well known in Chicago. His name is Eddie Bocanegra. Eddie is well known because he's articulate, he's convincing, he goes into the neighborhoods in the toughest gang situations and brings peace to neighborhoods where otherwise people were going to get killed. Eddie knows what it means to be involved in violent crime. He was convicted of murder. Senator Cruz, he was convicted of murder when he was a teenager. And he served over 20 years in prison. When he was released, he's gone to the work that I've just described. There obviously was a purpose in his life that he never would have realized had he spent the rest of his natural life in prison. But someone took a chance on Eddie and believed that he deserved that chance. And he has proven, I think, over and over again every single day since that he understands the gravity of his crime, but he also understands the opportunity that's been given him to make this a better world. You've described someone who was involved in monstrous conduct. You use the word monster. I think that is an apt term. I don't believe that person, from where I sit, as you describe it, should be eligible. But I do believe that the process that we set up in the corrections bill, originally offered by Senators Cornyn and Whitehouse, for judges to take into consideration the reality of the person before them is a realistic standard. And to categorize all people in certain crime categories as ineligible, I think goes too far, and that's why I would oppose this amendment. Senator Booker.
I thank you. And again, I've gotten to know Senator Cruz well, and I know where his heart and his passion and his drive on these issues. I would reiterate what you said at the end, that horrific crime that's so shocking that he described, everybody in this committee sees horrific things like that for what they are. And this bill, as it stands, what we are doing here, will make sure that someone like that cannot meet this extraordinarily high bar. And so I share that spirit. I share that horror and that grief and that pain. But Senator Durbin, you described something that I know very well. I'm one of the few senators here that lives in a community where people are shot top of my block, a young man who I knew, watched grow up, got his head exploded by an assault rifle. Across the street from me, there was a shooting in front of a drug treatment center. I have seen too many kids, and this is where Ted Cruz is so on point, because it's often low-income and minority communities that are facing the horrors of this violence. And that's why I find it really incredible that the capacity for compassion and empathy, the understanding that we have brokenness, as Thomas Merton says, we're all collections of broken bones, that the wisdom in my community is profound. Because folk understand, as I've learned, going to too many funerals and meeting with the people that did these heinous crimes themselves, all the things that go into some of these children, from their lead paint poisoning, their child abuse, that doesn't excuse their murder and the decades they will get on their sentence. But what you said, Senator Durbin, really moved me. Because in my community, some of the most heroic men on the front lines of some of this violence that are stopping it, organizations like My Brother's Keeper, organizations in Newark like SOS, Save Ourselves, these are returning offenders back on the street trying to find a path of redemption. And these guys went away for murder. And they are now saving lives. And they are giving a testimony in our community that there are no throwaway people. Humanity is not disposable. So I know there are these mass murderers that God, I would come forward and say they should never come out of prison. But in the brokenness of communities, where children are poisoned by toxins in their soil, in their air, where children face abuse, and then we in foster care systems see compounded abuse, where children witness violence at such an early age that when fireworks go off in some of our neighborhoods, they're diving for cover and showing signs of post-traumatic stress. When those children cross a line in our society and are sent to jail and stay there for decades and come out and show the truth of humanity and start saving lives, I know those people well as well. And I think they deserve some shot, high as a bar as it may be, that even though they did the most unimaginable, breaking one of the 10 commandments, that we still are a nation that believes people can find that path to redemption. So I pray my colleagues will think about those people, to know the person that Ted Cruz described will not come out, but the people that you and I know from Chicago to Newark, that we'll think about those people when we decide whether we're going to vote on this amendment, vote for this amendment. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, my state isn't immune from this sort of violence that we're hearing about nationwide. Just this weekend, a juvenile in Davenport, Iowa, fired 80 rounds. Lucky nobody was shot, but probably people could have been hurt. I assume this amendment's intent is to make sure that juvenile parole eligibility isn't afforded to those who are in danger to the community. And I agree with that sentiment, and for that reason, I'm going to support this amendment.
Thank you, Senator. I've just been informed that the Council of Prison Locals, which represents correctional officers who work in BOP facilities, has just informed us this morning that they are endorsing the First Step Implementation Act provision on juvenile parole. They work with these inmates every day. Is there any further conversation or discussion of the Senator Leahy?
Chairman, I'll be brief, but it's very easy when you talk about a murder case of any kind to say, lock the door and never unlock it on the person. I think Senator Booker has eloquently pointed out some of the things behind it. I'm one of the few senators, and I served with 400 senators. I'm one of the very few who has gone to many murder scenes, often at 3 o'clock in the morning, versus a 26-year-old prosecutor. I'd leave my home and my family and go to some of the most gruesome murder scenes. I'd prosecute the people involved. But one thing I learned is every one of them is different. Every one of them is different. From the murderer I prosecuted who had been paid to murder somebody, to another case as the victim was being carried to the hospital, somebody I'd known for years. I asked him, who did this? He shook his head no, and I said, please tell me who did this. He said, my son did, and died while I was holding his hand. Now, if anybody thinks one size fits all, it does not. Give the flexibility that this bill requires. Are the judges going to be right every single time? No. Are the prosecutors going to be right every single time? No. But one size does not fit all, and give the flexibility. Thank you.
Is there any further discussion on the Cruz amendment before us now? Roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy?
No.
Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Ms. Hirono? Mr. Booker? Mr. Padilla?
No by proxy.
Mr. Ossoff? Mr. Grassley?
Aye.
Mr. Graham?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning? Mr. Lee? Mr. Cruz? Mr. Sass?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Hawley? Mr. Cotton?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Tillis?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
Aye by proxy.
Chair Durbin?
No.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 11 yeas, 11 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Cruz?
I'd like to make two comments. Number one, there's an old saying that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Unfortunately, it does not appear this committee has learned from that saying. Across the country, there are advocates of criminal justice reform who are watching what's happening here today. And they may well celebrate in a few minutes when your bill is getting ready to pass out of committee. But unfortunately, we're repeating exactly the same pattern this committee has done before. In a prior Congress, I introduced a series of amendments on a prior iteration of First Step to eliminate retroactivity and to exclude violent crimes. And the same thing happened then that happened here today, which is the committee voted it down. Then, as now, there was a majority on the Judiciary Committee to vote down every one of those amendments. You get all the Democrats and a couple of Republicans, that's enough to vote them down. And what I predicted then, in this room, I said, well, you can vote it out of committee, but what you've just done is killed this bill. There's some members of this committee that are relatively new to the Senate. This bill will be voted out, and the chances that it passes on the floor of the Senate right now, having rejected all three of those amendments, I can quantify with exact precision. The chances that this bill passes into law are 0.0%. And most of the members of the committee know that. Certainly the senior members who've been around here for a while know it's not going to get the votes to pass on the floor. So it may feel good as a partisan exercise to vote down all the amendments, but for the advocates of criminal justice reform at home, what you've just seen is the process failing because the bill won't pass. And both sides know that. Let me make a second point. We are in polarized times. We're in angry times. Each side yells and screams at each other. There's too much hate on both sides of the aisle. We're convinced the other side is always in the wrong.
And this, we don't know.
I hope that that fever breaks in time. Donald Trump was a unique president. Unique in good respects and unique in some respects that were not so good. One of the consequences of Donald Trump is that he drove our Democratic colleagues stark raving mad. And we are living in a world where congressional Democrats have been radicalized by 4 years of Donald Trump. There used to be such a creature as moderate Democrats. I'm not convinced there is such a thing anymore. In the last 5 months of the Biden administration, with Schumer and Pelosi leading Congress, Senate Democrats have 3 times had votes to determine where they are on the question of violent criminals, on the question of the very worst violent criminals, murderers, rapists, child molesters. And the only reasonable conclusion an objective observer can derive from what we've seen the last 5 months is Senate Democrats have made the decision that they are the party that supports violent criminals. Why do I say that? Because on the floor, when I introduced an amendment to say we should not send stimulus checks, $1,400 checks from the taxpayers to criminals currently incarcerated, to murderers, to rapists, and child molesters, every single Democrat voted no. It failed by 1 vote. That means every Democrat was the deciding vote, and the federal government sent millions of dollars to criminals currently incarcerated, many for horrific crimes. Likewise, in the Rules Committee, I had a series of amendments to strike from S1, what many are calling the Corrupt Politicians Act, the provisions to mandate that criminals and felons be allowed to vote, and in particular focused on murderers, rapists, and child molesters. And once again, you saw Senate Democrats line up over and over and over again to say they wanted to strike down the state laws that prohibit the very worst criminals from being able to vote. And now today, we're not even talking about sending money to criminals. We're not even talking about letting criminals vote. We're talking about mass murderers and rapists. Do you let them out early? I guarantee you, every one of you, if you went home to your states, even in very blue states like Illinois, your constituents would be quite astonished that not a single Democrat on this committee is willing to say, let's not let mass murderers out early. That does not reflect moderation. In most prior Senates, there would have been some Democrats who say, well, okay, excluding murderers, excluding rapists, maybe that has some merit, let's find a middle ground. But post-Trump, today's Democrats don't do middle ground. That's unfortunate for criminal justice reform because, as I said, as a consequence of today's votes, we're getting ready to vote on this bill. It'll pass out of committee. You'll get all the Democrats, you'll get a couple of Republicans. And then, in all likelihood, it will never come up on the floor. If it comes up on the floor, it's not getting 60 votes. Doesn't have a prayer of getting 60 votes. First Step Act passed because for a brief moment, Senate Democrats were willing to find a middle ground and compromise, and in particular, accepted my amendments to exclude violent criminals. Unfortunately, that brief moment of reasonableness and common ground seems to have passed us. I think that is unfortunate for the Senate, and it's even more unfortunate for the country.
The senator from Texas reminds us of his view of the Democratic Party regularly. That's his right. under the rules of the Senate and this committee. But I think if we reflect on what we are working on at this moment and have worked on in this committee, it defies his description. This bill, which he has condemned as some sort of a liberal trope, some departure of radical left Democrats, the bill has broad bipartisan support, including the American Conservative Union, Freedom Works, law enforcement leaders, Association of Prosecuting Attorneys Leadership Conference, and many more. The bill that we are extending and making retroactive was signed into law originally by Donald Trump. It was supported across the board by the Koch brothers, as I mentioned earlier, many conservative leaders, and the reason was basic. We believe that we can do a better job of making Americans safe by having a different standard when it comes to justice and incarceration. Senator Cruz disagrees. That is his right to disagree. But I think when we look at the evidence of the incarceration rates in the United States of America, at least the Senate Judiciary Committee not only has the right, has the responsibility to ask what is going on in America. Why are we filling the prisons more than any other country on earth? Are we that violent? Are we that criminal in our intent and our conduct to expect this to be normal? And are people in prison who frankly have been there too long or never should have been there? We know what's happened with videotapes and DNA. Innocence projects across America are finding people who are sitting on death row for decades were actually innocent, were wrongly prosecuted. Should we care? If you believe in justice, you should. What this bill has basically said was, we are giving some prisoners the right to petition for an opportunity for resentencing. Only an opportunity, no guarantee. And some of them don't have a ghost of a chance of ever seeing that happen. But for some, it will bring real justice. I want to be party to that. I'm ready to take the risk that others, like Senator Cruz, will criticize me for being soft on crime. That goes with the territory, I think, serving on the Senate Judiciary Committee. In the middle of this debate, to have the Council of Prison Locals, the correctional officers in BOP facilities informing us that they endorse our efforts to pass this law, these are the men and women who risk their lives every day in these prisons. They believe that what we're doing is reasonable. So at this point, at the urging of Senator Grassley, the clerk will call the roll on the passage of the bill.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Excuse me, I'm
Forgive me.
sorry. Senator Ossoff seeks recognition.
Just a brief reflection. The senator from Texas opened his remarks bemoaning the bitter partisanship that's infected the culture of this institution. I believe, Senator Cruz, that you offered the amendment that was just narrowly defeated in good faith. I believe you made meritorious arguments in advocating for it. I weighed it carefully, listened carefully to the debate, complex issues involving the prospects of redemption for juvenile offenders, and made my decision in good faith. And I want to note the irony that after bemoaning the partisanship and the culture of division and mistrust that's infected this institution, my friend, the senator from Texas, then launched into a partisan diatribe impugning the motives and integrity of his colleagues who came to a different view. Now, I'm new to this body, and I recognize that long tenure here and long careers in politics can jade and make cynical all of us who participate in the process of making very difficult decisions about weighty subjects with serious implications for people's lives. But I hope that as the senator from Texas and I continue to build a relationship, and as we all work together to try to advance the cause of justice in this country, that we can cease to presume the worst motives and partisan intent and recognize that we may come to different views on these issues in good faith. And I yield.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Grassley asks unanimous consent to enter a statement in the record without objection.
Mr. Chairman, a brief comment in response. I thank the senator from Georgia for his comments. I would note that in my remarks, I don't believe I did impugn the motives or character of Senate Democrats. Rather, I focused on 3 specific issues that I raised before this body for a vote, and the votes that were taken. Votes are different from motives. They are objective actions. And I believe the votes that Senate Democrats have taken, repeatedly sending money to murderers, rapists, and child molesters, striking down laws that prohibit murderers, rapists, and child molesters from voting, and now voting for legislation to release from prison early murderers, rapists, and child molesters. I believe those votes are objectively extreme and radical. The only, as best I can recall, the only thing I remotely said about motives was I did acknowledge that President Trump drove Senate Democrats crazy. I don't think that's a terribly objectionable observation. I suspect many folks on both sides of the aisle would agree with that observation. I hope Senate Democrats behave differently, but there is a difference between impugning motives and pointing to clear, objective votes that I promise you, if you were to ask the voters in your states, and even the bluest states here, should we send money to murderers, rapists, and child molesters? Should we strike down laws prohibiting murderers, rapists, and child molesters from voting? And should we release from jail early murderers, rapists, and child molesters? I guarantee you 80% of your constituents in every one of your states would say hell no to all 3 of those. And so those, I believe, are objectively extreme votes. And I hope that pattern of voting, I hope that changes.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Feinstein.
It's on passage.
Final passage. Final passage.
On final passage.
Yes.
Aye.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Aye.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Coons. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Booker. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Ossoff.
Aye.
Mr. Grassley.
Aye.
Mr. Graham.
No by proxy.
Mr.
Oh,
Cornyn.
I'm sorry, no by proxy.
No by proxy.
Yeah.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Cruz.
No.
Mr. Sass.
No by proxy.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Tuck.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Tillis.
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn.
No by proxy.
Chair Durbin.
Aye.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 13 yeas, 9 nays.
The bill will be favorably reported to the floor. I want to thank the members of the committee for the early morning session, and I think we accomplished quite a bit together. If no one else seeks recognition, the meeting stands adjourned.